Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. Major update today on exactly what is currently going on behind the scenes at Red Bull, with reports emerging that the big summit that they held in Dubai just after the Jeddah Grand Prix resulted in not Christian Horner's power being loosened, but actually the other way around. It seems absolutely certain now that Christian Horner will not go anywhere from the Red Bull team. That means one of two things. Either Jos Verstappen, Helmut Marko and that camp will quietly back down, step away if not resign, or they will stand their grounds and Max Verstappen will leave the team in the near future. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, Williams, they are trying their best to fix their car for Japan. James Vowell says, yes, I am confident we will be able to fix the chassis. Albon crashed it, of course, in Australia. They didn't have a spare one. He was in the car. Didn't get points, of course, in the end. Probably Sargent wouldn't have done either, but arguably they've hurt Sargent's confidence for really no upside. They do say, yep, they should get the chassis repaired with no issues, but it's obviously a concern because they've got to prioritise fixing the chassis. They don't have the time to build a new one, as in a new spare one, so that will have to wait. So probably for Japan and then almost certainly for China as well, they'll be running again two chassis, which if something goes wrong, all of a sudden they can have the same circumstance again, at which point, let's say it does happen again, Albon crashes in Japan, just for example, Sargent put it in the wall there, didn't he, last year, just out of interest if that was to occur, what would they do? Would they take, if Albon was to crash, Sargent out of the car again, as they've just done, or would it be second time a different story? I don't know what you do if you're Vowels at that point. But unfortunately for Williams, they're in a bit of a tricky spot, right? Because, well, they had such a disastrous winter trying to fix up their whole back-end structure. They just didn't have enough time to actually put the car together. Now, there's lots to say as well on the state of the cars right now, especially the top teams. So Formula Uno, Gianluca Kessa and others, very close with Ferrari from like an information point of view. They do the occasional live stream discussing what they've heard about the cars. Now, I thought a lot of this was very fascinating, so we've got to mention it in terms of how the Ferrari can progress, but also with regard to the other teams as well. So these are just like, I didn't listen to this, so take it with a grain of salt because, you know, these aren't the words that I've put together, but this is what we believe they had to say on the live stream. First of all, the thought was that Ferrari was the best looking car on Friday at Melbourne, which they believe means that the work done in Maranello prior to the race is the benchmark in the paddock. If it had been a sprint weekend with one practice session, nobody would have caught up with Sainz and Leclerc. Also discussing how the victory is a signal, especially even in the Jeddah final stint when Leclerc and Verstappen had the same pace. There's also a feeling that in Japan, they're going to bring lots of new pieces to the car. They'll bring a few new things to Japan, and then Imola, they will have a big push, apparently bringing a new floor, tighter deck lids, whatever that translates from, and air intakes. A more extreme, brand new car for Ferrari at that point, and they believe the SF24 is a very solid base to build. Now, Red Bull are also bringing their own upgrades to Japan, so if Red Bull take a big step forwards and then Ferrari do the same, then sure, it's still going to be difficult to catch Red Bull. Japan should again be great for the Red Bull, given the nature of the circuit. But as time progresses, we'll see. The SF24 doesn't seem to be especially favourable or unfavourable at any particular tracks. It's much more consistent and doesn't have any major faults. Behrman showed, of course, in Jeddah that it's relatively easy to drive, gives the drivers lots of confidence. Yes, it still has its weaknesses in terms of performance on the new rubber from a peak performance perspective, but it's not massively problematic as last year's car was. So that's what they have to say on it. This is also, I think this was posted on the Reddit and then was deleted when that version was posted, but this also considers what the other teams are up to, just with regard to the car we just mentioned. The belief is that Red Bull might be somewhat more vulnerable than we would have expected after Bahrain and Jeddah. Discussion that this whole tear-off stuck in the floor issue for Perez sounds a little bit strange, and discussions that he wouldn't have had the pace to challenge Norris anyway. They also comment on Mercedes and say that it's an absolute disaster. They're in a sea of trouble, compounded by the fact they've lost loads of great engineers. Their car is, and I quote here as the guy who put this initially together said, an SF23, last year's Ferrari, without the straight line speed. So that is quite a damning indictment to their car, and Allison does seem to be kind of upbeat, but I'm not really sure why. We'll discuss that in a second. So Aston Martin, also an SF23 situation, but a bit better than Mercedes. Japan will be the benchmark. Red Bull will probably be a rocket. McLaren could be fast because of the high-speed corners in Sector 1 and really throughout the entire lap. The McLaren should be good there. Ferrari probably still behind the Red Bull. But all of a sudden, unless Red Bull take a major step forward with their package over the next couple of races, Ferrari believe their car is a solid base they can build on. Certainly Fred Vasseur believes that's the case, and they genuinely think they can actually catch Red Bull this year. Ferrari are saying, yeah, they've started the year with with a relatively basic platform. They're now going to build on that, and all of a sudden, after the first 2 races, it seemed 99.9 recurring percent likely that Verstappen and Red Bull are going to win both championships. All of a sudden, after the events of Australia, not just the DNF, but mainly just the pace that Ferrari had, gives a feeling that, you know what, this might not be a complete bloodbath this season. Max Verstappen is still very likely to win the vast majority of races, but I do believe that there will be circuits this year where the Ferrari is genuinely the fastest car on pace that weekend, and it was quite possibly the case in Australia. We just don't really know because Verstappen didn't finish the Grand Prix. Ferrari, though, still needs to find time. Vasseur thinks it's possible that they can find 4/10. Their plan is not to find 4/10, their plan is to find 400ths 10 times, and that's what he says, like it's 10 details you add to the car, each of which brings 400ths of a second, then they can get there. But even based on Las Vegas last year, circuits with high graining, they were very competitive with the Red Bull, and that was the same story in Albert Park in Australia, Melbourne. So the question would be, if Pirelli continue their trends this season, as they did in Australia, going a step softer on the tyre compounds, because everybody knows, let's be honest, that a 2-stop race is generally more entertaining than a 1-stop. The feeling has been that the tyres in certain conditions don't degrade enough. Other times they degrade too much, possibly. There's too much tyre saving the drivers too. We talked about this topic, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But if they continue this step, really, Pirelli, of going a little bit softer in the compounds they choose, all of a sudden that might help Ferrari rather significantly. McLaren say they can actually beat Ferrari, though. They think they're quite close. So all of a sudden we've got Ferrari thinking they can maybe try and challenge Red Bull and beat them. McLaren are saying maybe they can challenge Ferrari. So all of a sudden we've got a rather interesting season on our hands. But one team that seems to be nowhere near the play is Mercedes, because they've had so many issues, and as we just saw the guys on the Formula Uno show mention, they think Mercedes is an absolute disaster and nothing is turning around anytime soon. James Allison says, yeah, we've got great models, amazingly good models, but the devil's in the detail. And he basically just says a bunch of words which amount to, yeah, we need to improve in this area, and it doesn't really make much sense. They also confirmed in this interview, James Allison, that they don't know what caused Hamilton's engine failure. He had a catastrophic failure in Melbourne, and therefore when the failure occurs, they immediately, just automatically, the engine will just switch off, because otherwise it's going to blow itself apart. So that's what happens. The oil pressure dropped, there was a massive failure, and yeah, the engine therefore just shut itself off and decided not to destroy itself. So that's what happens. The question is why, right? Why did that first chain of events occur? Mercedes said that as of at least announcing their video on this yesterday, they still don't know. So it's not great, is it? I mean, when it rains, it pours right now, I suppose, for Mercedes, and there's no doubt that Hamilton is rather satisfied about his decision to move to Ferrari as it stands. Before we discuss the Red Bull thing, though, I wanted to mention this. Australia will return as the season opener next year in 2025, as it was previously. This has been known, I think, for some time. It's now been discussed by Joe Soward and others. So due to Ramadan, I believe they're moving Bahrain and Jeddah further back in the calendar, and we will start in Australia. This does raise questions, I suppose, on what are we going to do for testing, because recently it's been Bahrain testing, then Bahrain Grand Prix. Are we going to test in Bahrain, go to Australia to come back to Bahrain? I don't know about that. Are we going to test in... Not in Australia doesn't make any sense as a test track. It's different in so many ways to some of the other circuits. Maybe we test in Spain again and then go to... I wouldn't mind that, because if the Barcelona Grand Prix is going to be lost for Madrid in a couple of years, then maybe keep it as a test track at the start of the year. I don't mind that either. A couple of things also he mentions, in addition to this Melbourne 2025 stuff and how that's going to shape out, is also on Renault. So he says, oh, nasty people, which I guess includes me, keep bringing up the 100-race project, first divided in 2021. By the end of this season, the team's total will hit 90 races, which means the whole thing looks like a massive cock-up, which Renault might wish to move on from. And there's a theory that, given the fact that there's no shortage of potential buyers, Renault may prefer to sell the team, keep the engine division as Alpine, use some of the money raised to improve the power unit, or make the target to win Le Mans instead, or maybe to enter IndyCar. So that's the feeling right now, that yeah, the team's such a disaster, and working their way out of this mess is such a problem that Luca Di Maio, the boss of Renault, who thought he understood how to run racing teams, must now make a rather significant decision. He also mentions on the driver situation that Behrman has effectively created something of a, what he described, a Behrman effect, where teams up and down the grid are now thinking, you know what, Ollie Behrman just stepped into that Ferrari around Jeddah of all tracks and did a stellar job with it. And despite the fact that Behrman is one of the shining stars of Formula 2, it's not like he's dominating that championship by any means and is clear-cut the best driver. There's other drivers either in reserve positions for these teams or just in Formula 2 or in other sports right now, other kind of categories right now, that could do a great job. And the feeling is that, yeah, a cheap driver and young driver like Behrman or others make a lot more sense maybe than experienced but rather expensive drivers elsewhere on the grid. So, you're talking about Bottas, Magnussen, Ricciardo, Hülkenberg, maybe Stroll, don't know about that, Sargent Joe, these type of drivers are now increasingly at risk because teams think, yeah, well, Behrman did a great job there. Haas are probably going to put him in the car next year, probably alongside Hülkenberg, unless he goes to Audi, Sauber, which is certainly still possible. The word is that Haas would be happy to take Behrman, probably alongside Hülkenberg, in 2025, if Ferrari asks them nicely and offered a suitable discount on the engines. In any case, Behrman is still in the picture at Ferrari, as they'll be looking to be keen to train up a youngster to replace Lewis Hamilton when he retires. Of course, that might be quite a while away, but Charles Leclerc went through something relatively similar. But let's discuss this Red Bull situation, because it's been chaos for approximately the last 2 months, but over the last week or so it's calmed down to some degree. Now, is that the calm before the storm raises once again? Because Jos Verstappen made very clear a couple of weeks ago now at the start of March that if Horner remains in the team will explode. So after Jeddah, there was a summit effectively of the Red Bull ownership group. We're not just talking Red Bull Formula 1 team, we're talking Red Bull as an entire entity. So the Austrian side of the business, Mintzlaff and others, and then Yoovidyha, the Thai side of the business, with Horner, maybe with Marco, I don't know. All the key players were there in Dubai to discuss the situation. And the feeling was that the Austrians are basically going to tell Yoovidyha, hey, if you keep Horner around, we're going to have all these issues. Our partners want to pull out. Ford aren't very happy with us. There's also been talk about potential like US retailers refusing to stock Red Bull because of all the drama in their stores. So the feeling was that, yeah, they were going to tell Yoovidyha that, and Yoovidyha was going to say, you know what, you might be right. Maybe it's just easier to get rid of Horner and therefore, keep Verstappen, and all these other things can happen as a result. I'm not really sure that matters to Yoovidyha. He really looks at it from a more business overall perspective, whereas Dietrich Mateschitz, when he was alive, was really more interested, I think, in the Formula 1 team than the Thai owners presently are. I think they're probably quite happy to let Horner run the show over there, and that is clearly what they want to do. So this is what was discussed in the article here. What was also quite fascinating about this is that they confirmed, at least AMUS mentioned it, which is not as good as confirmation, but not far off, what we've said over the last couple of weeks, that the plan indeed is to have Horner take over control of this part of the business. There has been a rumour now for some time that Horner's plan was to use some British financiers to effectively buy out Red Bull Technologies as an entity from Red Bull themselves. So Red Bull can either still fund it or can potentially get paid for the rights to use their brand on that organisation, but it can be a separate entity, which maybe makes more sense as an energy drinks brand to kind of separate off the other things so they have somewhat more control where their money goes rather than, worrying about what could be rather money-sinking projects. So apparently, though, in Dubai, there was an expectation that Horner's position would be weakened as a result of this big meeting between the Thai and the Austrian faction. Rumour has it, though, that the Thais went on an unexpected offensive. The Austrian faction, Oliver Mintzlaff and Franz Watzlawick, who came into the picture a couple of weeks ago, apparently now more concerned about keeping their positions. They feel like, because at the end of the day, they're part of the 49% Austrian ownership with Mark Mateschitz, Dietrich's son, and now all of a sudden there seems to be a pushback the other way. So yeah, it doesn't seem like this situation is going to settle down necessarily. Rumours are even emerging that Red Bull Holdings might relocate entirely to Dubai. So there's no doubt major changes afoot behind the scenes within the Red Bull organisation. So this is what the article here goes on to say behind a paywall, but I'll leave a link down below. Junaid, as he always does, just throws it up straight on Twitter and then links it down below. But yeah, we mentioned these first couple of paragraphs. The feeling, though, is that Yoovidyha is fully behind Horner's plans. The only way that this is going to change is if the appeal that has been made by the woman who brought the accusations goes to a civil court. If they were to find Horner guilty, or, something like that, then presumably this support could be shaken. But if it hasn't been shaken by now, it's very hard to believe that Horner is going to be going anywhere. And by the time that happens, if it even were to, Horner might have been able to have the breathing room to take measures that will bring him to the top of the company. So far, Horner has not been able to rule his own racing team as he has wanted. This starts with the fact that he has to have investments above a certain amount approved by the Austrian side, i.e. Helmut Marko. Before Mateschitz' death, power was also significantly limited when it came to personnel decisions, the question everyone is asking is how Max Verstappen will react. This is the piece here that said that Horner allegedly wants to take complete power in both the beverage company and the motorsport empire. So certainly the motorsport empire, but the idea that Horner, and this is what you got to understand about this sport, the egos in play are borderline immeasurable. Like, Horner wants more power and as much as he can possibly get, it seems right now. And I can understand it in the sense that he's built Red Bull as a Formula One team into where they are today, and he wants, more kind of consequences for that in terms of he's effectively an employee. I'm sure he wants some degree of ownership and control over the situation. Now, whether he wants to effectively take over the role that Mintzlaff and Watzlawick and those other guys have to not only run the motorsport side, but also on the beverage side of the business, I mean, that'd be kind of crazy. But, even if that is absolutely ridiculous, which maybe it is, but honestly, who knows, with this guy Christian Horner, then certainly his plan is to have full control over the motorsport empire. And that then leads into, if this occurs, what is happening next? Jos Verstappen has made it clear that if Horner stays, it's going to explode. Helmut Marko is very clearly at odds with Christian Horner over this. So are those two respective parties going to slink away quietly into the night and Marko will just resign at some point and, Jos Verstappen will back off and do something else? That seems doubtful, because as I've said, the egos at play here are borderline immeasurable. So I imagine the parties involved are somewhat plotting their next move, and it feels that, if Marko does decide, okay, you know what, Horner's going to stay, I'm going to resign, we know that Marko entered a clause, we believe, into Verstappen's contract over the last few months, which allows Verstappen to leave if that was to be the case. We know Mercedes are very interested in Verstappen. We know that Aston Martin are very interested in Verstappen. Aston are also interested in getting Newey, which we talked about the other day, especially if they get the Saudi money and Saudi ownership coming through, where they will have unlimited funds to offer what they want. Mercedes are apparently less interested. And then, of course, there's talk about who potentially could go to Red Bull instead. Flavio Briatore, Alonso's manager, now apparently sees a better opportunity at Red Bull than he does at Mercedes. And this is now possible. And the belief is of MUS that actually Alonso makes maybe a little bit more sense in terms of the Red Bull brand image than, as they describe here, Alonso is a better choice for Red Bull than Sainz, who is also sailing in the Bermuda Triangle between Red Bull, Mercedes and Aston, hoping to impress because of his uncompromising nature. He fits the Red Bull outlaw image a little bit better. And we believe over the last few days that Horner wants to bring Alonso into the team, which to me says that it's far from a guarantee that Verstappen stays. Because given the way that Red Bull have been run over the last few years with the very clear number one, number two driver dynamic, bringing Alonso in would certainly break the mould unless there is some other decision-making power at play. So Verstappen's manager is said to have met with the Thai bosses in Dubai after the Australian Grand Prix. The content of the conversation is unclear, but it was hardly about convincing Yoovidyha that Horner had to step down. The feeling is it's more likely that he has given the Thais the pure wine. If Horner remains in power, Max Verstappen is gone. So what do you guys think about this? Everything happened in Dubai after Jeddah. Now apparently Verstappen's manager has effectively said to the Thai ownership, hey, if Horner stays, then Max is going to go. But it seems to me that they are very comfortable with that eventuality. So Christian Horner intending to take his next step towards world domination and, in effect, as a result of this, potentially blowing apart the entire team. But clearly he has the belief that he can build it up from the ashes once again, if that is what actually occurs over the coming days and weeks. But massively intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, if you are Max Verstappen and this is occurring and the feeling is that they want out of the team if Horner stays, for whatever reason you might speculate on that, Mercedes does not seem like an especially attractive option right now, which is why what I said a couple of weeks ago about the Aston Martin thing starts to make a little bit more sense as time progresses. But then again, what if Mercedes were to nail it with their engine regulations in 2026, as they might well quite possibly do? So fascinating circumstances. What I will say is, I'll double down on what I said a couple of weeks ago now, right? Because a few weeks ago when we talked about the whole Red Bull drama internally, there was even discussion that I don't really think I mentioned earlier, but I think it was said right about here that Red Bull's frustration or their perplexing result in Australia might have been caused by the not so great situation in the team. Might be a stretch, but De Kessler said that he doesn't believe in chance and he feels like the internal situation might be in some ways translating onto their up-track performances. But I think there's no doubt that we are at the peak of the Red Bull domination bubble. Maybe Jeddah, maybe Bahrain was the peak. Maybe last season will end up being the peak, who knows? But Mercedes are very clearly on their downhill spiral, and whether they can recover is a question. Red Bull are potentially on the way there as well. Difficult to say, but no doubt that things are more shaky internally at Red Bull than they've been in quite some time. So my feeling that I said probably a good 6 weeks or so ago now was that we might find ourselves in a world in the relatively near future when Formula One is once again about Ferrari versus McLaren. It's been this way before. The last time there was a podium where Ferrari and McLaren occupied all of the top 4 spots, so P1, 2, 3 and 4, all Ferraris, all McLarens, was back in 2007. Ferrari had a 1-2 there with Kimi and of course Felipe, and then Alonso was P3, Hamilton was P4. It's been a long time since we had a Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4 with McLaren, and we got one again of course at the Australian Grand Prix. So maybe there's something to be said for that in terms of what era we might be going into, but very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.